There we go. We're recording.
Beautiful. How are you?
I'm doing very well. I'm so excited for this. I saw your video and I listened, I listened to how you approached it, and I thought your comments were so clear and helpful that I thought, we could I was just excited. I wanted to talk to you because I thought we could have a productive conversation just kind of based on your comments.
Yeah, me too. I've really enjoyed listening to your videos, and I'm super excited about this conversation because I think there's so much antipathy between the theist and the atheist communities, and I'm hoping we can do a little bridging and actually get to kind of see each other for who we are and have a conversation that's open-ended and explore together. So
I completely agree. These food fights of winning, I listen to that and I think conversations just don't work that way.
Yeah. Yeah. I would agree.
Once the ego gets involved, we tend to dig in and then we can't. It's difficult to explore, to be honest.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think this is one of the things that the Peterson, whatever's going to happen with Peterson himself, he, at least in the intellectual dark web, seem to be using this new medium to open conversation and be productive. And to me, that is just really good.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so interested that you were talking about ego, because I identify with that absolutely. Of my, at least for me, when my ego digs in, right, it doesn't tend to be as productive of a conversation. And I think that's something that's really interesting about the whole integral conversation that we seem to be having. I wouldn't classify myself as a integral thinker, but it feels like there's this thing going on with maybe it's the intellectual deep web, but it's this deeper integration of not only the head stuff, the intellectual stuff, but also, I think Jeff Salzman's words were installing it in the heart. And this alignment between those two levels, which I don't know about you, but a lot of times conversations like this can feel very intellectual, specifically once you get into theism versus atheism. And so I think it'd be interesting to kind of explore it from both a lived in experience level and the intellectual level.
Yeah. Yeah. And I really appreciated your videos because I saw you had a real capacity for not only for articulating. If I say that you're articulate, maybe that's a microaggression, but not.
Oh, I'm very offended.
Because people with big beards aren't supposed to be articulate.
Right.
But I really appreciate it. I listened to how you approached it and I thought, oh, that was so helpful. And I didn't watch the whole of your much earlier video of, coming out as an atheist and talking about that. But I just sensed with you a real ability to talk, and so I thought this guy could be really a lot of fun to talk to. The whole Jordan Peterson YouTube thing for me has been about looking to have better conversations, and you can see I've been posting a lot of conversations lately, and I know for a lot of people don't want to be on YouTube, and I get that. But one of the things I think from Peterson is that we're seeing whatever he's doing in terms of product that he's giving us that's helpful. I think the modeling is at least as helpful.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. That's that integral thing again. It's the intellectual stuff within the lived in experience. It's like this strange intersection between almost self-help or inner work and intellectual thought. Which I guess is not that strange for you. I mean, you're a pastor, so you're this is right. Probably part and parcel of what you do is going through all the levels.
And I think same with Peterson, because he is a clinical psychologist, right. And because at least until recently he was a practitioner. You have to deal with real people, as opposed to, say, right. being an academic where your primary focus tends to be on the ideas, the abstractions.
Mm-hmm.
As a pastor, right. It's all the time.
You get to help people, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I should just say at the outset too, my parents were children's pastors, and so I'm aware of the enormous amount of work that goes into that and the enormous amount of self-sacrifice. And so I wanted to say at the outset, I just honor that in you. I mean, I can see that you're somebody who genuinely cares and is doing work to make the world a better place. So that's probably a good starting point, I think.
Well, could you tell a little bit of your story? I know you did in that one video, but probably a lot of people haven't seen it. So maybe just some introduction about, your story, because I found your story very interesting too.
Sure. Yeah. So I grew up evangelical Christian. I'll say a fundamentalist evangelical. We were non-denominational, but probably closest to Assemblies of God, something like that. And, I had a good upbringing. I wasn't abused or didn't have any kind of majorly bad things happen to me during my time with Christianity. At the same time, so I grew up that way. Then I went to college. I went to Oral Roberts University. So that's, I see the eyebrows raising. So that's just a fraught thing to say.
The big hands.
The praying hands, that's right. Oh, man. And the prayer tower, and you name it. There's all kinds of good stuff going on there. And we have our honorary fire truck coming by through my front lawn, as is usual, and will occur multiple times throughout this interview.
I was listening to your video. I was driving. I heard this siren. I'm looking around. I was like, where is it? Where is it?
Right.
Oh, it's in Denver.
Right. It's in Denver, and not at the same time. Yeah. Anyway, so I went to ORU, and I actually went all the way through ORU without, believe it or not, without really doubting the existence of God. And I think partly because it was so visceral. I was seeing people, or so I thought, I was seeing people healed. I was seeing lives changed and so on. So it felt very real. And I would say my relationship with God was very strong. I was not somebody who was on the outskirts of Christianity and somewhat skeptical the whole time, or didn't feel a connection with God. I really did feel that connection and have a personal relationship with Jesus, is what I would have said at the time. Kind of had a mental dialogue going with what I thought was God for however many years that ended up being. And then around 22, after college, a couple things happened. One is I embarked on a study of world religion and comparative religion. And that, for me, started to cast doubt on some of the fundamentalist ideas that I had held to be true. And so that was the intellectual side. And then looking back now, I can see there wasn't just an intellectual side. I think there was also a lived in experience that was problematic for me on Christianity. I think Christianity did not help me accept myself. It exacerbated problems with accepting myself. And so it didn't fit internally, and it started not to fit externally at some point, even though I did believe. But once, it's actually Karen Armstrong's book, A History of God, which was kind of the last straw for me. When I saw that even the history of religious belief could be explained by natural causes, that was really the final straw for me of like, okay, well, really then it looks to me like almost, or really everything can be explained by natural causes. So I just don't have a good reason to believe in the supernatural anymore. So I left the faith, which was a really hard decision. It was not something I wanted to do. It was not, I had no desire to become an atheist or something like that. It really felt like it almost was like I accidentally took off my glasses and realized the room is blue, not red, and everybody thinks it's red. And it was like, well, crap, I can't unsee this now. That's what it felt like. So then I plunged into really the darkest period of my life, kind of the dark night of the soul thing. And deep depression, and it just left an enormous void in my life to leave religion. And so not only did it take me away from my community and my family, but it left my worldview just totally in tatters. I really had no worldview. It was like, it wasn't as if I came to a new worldview so much as I came to the end of one. And so I really went on a tear of trying to understand this new world without Christianity. And so I studied ethics for a long time. That was really my first big question, is how can we ground ethics without God? And then meaning and purpose, that's taken longer. But I spent about a decade trying to fill that hole in that Christianity left with all different kinds of things, and not healthy things. A lot of drinking, a lot of smoking, a lot of I'll leave it there. And
YouTube is not necessarily a great confessional.
Right. Yeah, I'll leave it there. But then a couple of years ago, I really kind of turned down this path of inner work. And that was, it was right around the time that I discovered Jordan Peterson. It was also around the time that I discovered psychedelics, the Mankind Project, which is like a men's organization, therapy, and Landmark is another kind of organization that I became a part of for a little while. And so I embarked down this inner work journey, and I became, I think, more emotionally aware and more aware of my shadow and even what that meant, and not just in intellectual terms, but in lived-in terms. And I really came to a place where I started to be able to reclaim some of what or much of what I think I lost in Christianity, and actually to be able to reframe that story in a positive light, for my own benefit, I guess. And the way that I reframe that story is now, as a non-Christian, I don't convict myself of thought crime nearly as much. I'm able to accept even my shadow side. And and as a result, I feel more able to love myself. And so that's been just an enormous gift, and an unexpected gift that came out of being a non-Christian, and one that was hard fought over a decade or so. So then when I saw this intellectual dark or deep web conversation start to take shape, and the Jordan Peterson stuff start to take shape, I really wanted to be at pains to make a path forward for the conversation where I felt like we didn't lose what was fundamental to the Enlightenment, and for me, the values that I took during that decade that were sort of hard won. I wanted to keep those and take the best of religion, because for me, when I look back at my religious experience, it isn't as if I look at that in a way that's totally derogatory or dismissive or deflationary. Hopefully, I think I do see the value of much of it. And I think as a society, we're still asking ourselves the question, what do we do after the death of God? How do we reclaim what seems to have been lost in that? So yeah, so that's what part of what motivated me putting out the videos, is trying to kind of clear a path forward, hope maybe with some terms where I think we can kind of slice the ham just right, so that the Jordan Petersons of the world can still reanimate religion, but that we don't have to give up, for me, what is the truth of naturalism. So yeah, so that's sort of how I landed at where I landed at. What about you? Would you mind giving me just a kind of a similar summary of like both your intellectual but also your lived in experience of what God has meant to you and what Christianity means to you?
Well, I too grew up with Christian parents. My father was a pastor of a small, for lack of a better term, I'll call it a racial reconciliation church in Paterson, New Jersey. He as a seminary, you got to go back a few generations. My great-great-grandfather sent my great-grandfather to Western Michigan. And just a few years ago, we uncovered the fact that they were Jews. And I don't know what my great-great-grandfather did, but he did something, because he left the country with his family, and the rest of the brothers and sisters didn't leave. I can go back and look at genealogies.
Interesting.
And so did he leave the synagogue? But when they went to Western Michigan, they fit in with they've been living in the Netherlands among the Dutch and the Frisian, so they kind of fit in with that group and joined a Christian Reformed church in Western Michigan. And then my grandfather became a CRC minister and pastored churches around the Midwest during the Depression, and some on the East Coast, and one in Canada. And he was kind of known for being a dull preacher. When church, in fact, back in those days, you would just look for a minister who'd been someplace for a while and send him a letter of call, which is a request to come and work. And when my grandfather visited the church in Vermont, after listening to him preach, they wanted to uncall him, but he was so stubborn, he stayed. But they eventually grew to really love him, because it was his pastoral side that people really appreciated, his kindness and his ability to care for people. Yeah. So my father then grew up during the Depression and World War II in very isolated communities in the Midwest, in tiny little CRC enclaves. Went to Calvin College, went to Calvin Seminary in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and then took a call to Paterson, New Jersey, where he was supposed to take this kind of gospel and sandwich ministry and turn it into a church. And he stayed there 36 years, which is where I grew up. And my father was able to kind of integrate both my grandfather's kindness and my grandmother's sharpness. And my grandfather was always very smart, but he was so kind. He generally didn't have much conflict. My grandmother was full of conflict and very smart, and my father kind of had both of them. And he was kind, and so he ministered to the people of Paterson, New Jersey. Heroin was going through Paterson at that time. So I grew up in a fair amount of chaos in Patterson in terms of, there were heroin was going through the community. Many of the people were poor. The African American community, severely under stress for tons of historical reasons. And that was how I grew up. So on one hand, I lived and went and worshiped in this kind of Dutch Calvinist black church. And then I went to Christian school, which is another insular CRC thing with all the other little children of Dutch immigrants.
Yeah.
And that was my growth. And of course, you don't think about anything when you're doing that. It's just your life. And what it gave me was a sense of a comfort with chaos and the unanswered questions of life, because the world was just simply too chaotic to fit it into easy packages. And my father had a real good gift for that too. And so I learned that from him. I went to Calvin College, as is the Christian Reformed way, and then met someone who would become my wife. And so went to Calvin Seminary instead of Fuller Seminary, where I kind of wanted to go because I wanted to get out into the world. And then after seminary, went to the Dominican Republic for 7 years. And I talked about that with my conversation with Jonathan Peugeot and Gret a bit. The thing that taught me was the limitations of our ability to rescue communities. I worked with these Haitians. These were illegal immigrants in the Dominican Republic. They worked the bottom line jobs and tried to eke out an existence. They were always subject to, getting picked up on the street and dumped at the border, or harassed or manipulated because of their illegal status. And, they were desperately poor. And part of, I came in there a snot-nosed 20-something, imagining I had this great seminary education and the backing of a very generous denomination, only to realize, that it wasn't much we could do for these poor people. And even the ways that they wanted to help us, we could see through the generations of dependence of such types of missionary work between guilt-ridden, wealthy North Americans and desperately poor people who lived on the island of Hispaniola, that so often a lot of the helping hurt. So, we left there mostly because of, it was better for the family.
Oh, so you took your whole family there?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. We went there, my wife and I. She was the one who really wanted to be a missionary. Her father was a missionary in Nigeria, so her first 6 years, she grew up in Nigeria. But we came back to North America and, had a lot of work to do in terms of myself and in terms of my marriage and in terms of my family. Had another kid. We were pregnant when we left. And then stayed a few months in Grand Rapids to kind of heal, and then decided to get back into ministry. I'd never wanted to be a local church pastor. I think partly because I look so much like my father. I'm so much like my father. I kind of resented that growing up. And here I take a call to a church not unlike the church I grew up in. But then once getting into this place, I realized how much I enjoyed pastoring a church and enjoyed people. And this church, like my father's church, a high degree of chaos. This area of Sacramento, a lot of group homes, a lot of homeless, very ethnically diverse. And with all of my culture, I've never lived fully embedded in one culture. I've always been between cultures. So this felt very at home.
Yeah.
So in terms of, through the ups and downs of life, it's difficult to talk about. It's difficult to talk about darkness in my life, but there have been some very dark periods. And one of the interesting things that I noticed as I watched myself through those dark periods was that the more I suffered, the less I doubted. And the more I actually tried to persist in faithfulness and obedience, the stronger I became.
Mm-hmm.
And so on one hand, all of when I listen to your story, when I listen to many other stories, all of the cross pressures, as Charles Taylor calls them, we cannot live in this age, I think, if you're living out there in the secular public realm and not be assaulted with doubts. There are days that I sit and I think, what am I doing? I pastor a tiny, some would say dying church, and that many of the members are older. It's an extremely diverse church, ethnically diverse, wealth, education, it goes from PhD to people who are illiterate. It goes from millionaires to people who, don't have any money and live on the street. I mean, it's the whole realm. And I look at my father pastored that little church in Patterson for 36 years, went on to pastor another church. In some ways, he could look back at his life and say, what have I accomplished? I never wrote a great book. I never pastored a big church, all those typical standards of meaning. But at the same time, you talk to him. I remember asking him, he was retired and he had 5 Bible studies going, and he was just always doing ministry. This is just what he did.
Yeah, it was just in his blood.
And said, Dad, what do you think? He says, I love it more than I ever did. And I think, wow, that's when you get into your 70s, that's what you want to say.
Yeah, that means something. Yeah.
So on one hand, I completely respect people with stories like yours and skeptics and atheists who say, I just can't believe. I understand that because I feel that. But another part of me, I couldn't bear not living without a knowledge of God's capacity to redeem this world, which is, part of what I've always lived in. I've always lived in places with people who are just screwed.
Yeah.
If you're mentally ill, it's just going to be hard.
It's a tough road.
The Haitians, so many in the African American community, there's no hope that you're going to have the kind of life that gets projected to you through this industrial commercial complex that says the good life is, and it's on TV every day given to you. And these people, they will never, ever have that. And that's in the wealthiest, most stable situation that the world has ever seen, which is, the United States of America in many ways. It's not the common story of chaos and instability and seemingly mindless, purposeless suffering that, if any type of looking at the scope of human history means, most people have lived that way. And so, you asked me one of the questions, what is God? And one of the things I thought of is that I had a lot of thoughts about that question, but one of the things I like that, and it's so fun talking to you because you know the Bible, at least to a certain degree. I don't have to explain all of this, but when God shows up to Isaiah in the temple, he says, the seraphim says, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. So holy, holy, holy as he is. We are not going to get our heads around God. It is something that we as human beings are not capable of capturing by virtue of our limitation.
Yeah, it's ineffable.
At the same time, the whole earth is full of his glory. And so on one hand, and you see this if you go to a undeveloped part of the world and live and work with desperately suffering poor people.
Yeah.
On one hand, on every measure that we tend to assume in our culture of what the good life is, they don't have. Yet, I have never had any better meals than I've had in isolated Haitian communities with, you know, while we're having these 4-hour church services, a group of women, sorry ladies, that's who it is, a group of women are out back over a charcoal fire with a pile of rice and a few fish, and they make this amazing meal, and there's glory. And one of the things that I learned from the African American community was that if you grow up in it, you're not always the white guy. If you're a child, you can kind of be part of the community, and the joy and the laughter and the humor. And so on one hand, according to every metric that we have in our culture about what the good life is, they don't have. On the other hand, God's glory, even to these, what we would say, God-forsaken places of the world, is rich and full. And when I think about what the gospel means for our future, and this is why I won't give up on the quote-unquote supernatural.
Yeah, tell me.
That there is hope for these people. That they will never receive in this lifetime any kind of justice or recompense for the horrible things that have been done to them, both explicit and implicit. Yet there is hope for these people. And if in fact the world is such a place that there is no hope for these people besides the big sleep, and that Stalin, Mao, and Hitler basically, along with millions of people whose names we will never know, basically got away with it. I don't know. If the world is that way, I would become a darker, uglier, angrier, far more harmful person than I am now. And because I believe the story is such a beautiful one that we have from the gospel, it allows me to be hopefully grace-filled, to love my neighbor all the way to my enemy.
Right.
And so this is exactly what I see embodied in Jesus, who on one hand could be filled with rage so often, filled with frustration with his disciples, filled with rage at the religious authorities that he thought was so crippling the message of that Old Testament. At the same time, could extend grace to Roman soldiers who were the occupying force over his people. Could extend grace to tax collectors, and so then when Nicodemus comes to him at night, you know, he's hard on Nicodemus, but you know, who shows up at the end of the story, you know, kind of being concerned about his status, but yet can't let Jesus go. And so, you know, with Joseph of Arimathea, conspires to at least give him a decent burial. And so when I see Jesus, and when I see the world that the Bible tells me it really is more so than just the one we're living in right now.
Right.
I wouldn't want to have any other way. Plus the fact, one last thing, and then I'll shut up because I talk too much. Plus the fact that if Sam Harris is right, I have no reason to buy what he says the world is.
Which is, what do you think?
Which is, you know, if I don't see any ought in materialism.
Okay, right. Yep.
And so I think, okay, if the materialists are right, I'm going to continue to live in this religious fantasy, you know? You can think of me what you want, but because I cannot stand to imagine that the glory of this world will not finally be fulfilled, and the sufferers of this world will not finally be redeemed, and the injustices of this world will not finally be addressed. And all of this, the only way this could happen would be an absolutely perfect judge who is not biased. And I know we have questions about heaven and hell, but someone who could actually manage that perfectly. And only a holy, holy, holy God could do that. And so that's why I'm unwilling to, on one hand, deny all of the hard questions that the materialists have to bring, but at the same time, not deny the hope and the glory that I find in Christianity.
Well said, Paul. And let me start off. There's a lot there, so I may not. I try to take some notes on different points. I may not hit all of them, but But let me just start off by saying I feel the weight of that as well. I feel the weight of the injustices in the world. I feel the weight of, like you were talking about, those people with certain issues where they'll never have the good life, or just the horrific suffering that occurs that is essentially pointless. I feel the weight of that. So I'll tell you two different pictures that I see that kind of emerge from the death of God and the result of those. And maybe it'll kind of help us, or at least help me answer how I might think about some of these points that you've raised. So the first is after Nietzsche proclaims the death of God in whatever it was, 1890 something, there's one picture that represents the almost like a Garden of Eden, where humanity was with God, things were harmonious and great in the garden, and then after the garden, we're now banished into basically this darkness. And that would certainly be the view, I think, of Dostoevsky. And I think when I left the faith, that was how I initially felt, was, oh my gosh, I'm out here in the world. And it turns out there isn't a supernatural God. There isn't this final judge. There isn't a foundation for morality outside of God. And so I basically started off as a nihilist. So I feel the weight of that. And it wasn't a fun place to be, I'll tell you. You can imagine. Right. But there's a second picture, which I think for me gradually emerged. And that second picture is the story of the Wizard of Oz. So, by the way, I'm totally just reading into the Wizard of Oz here. I don't think Frank Baum actually meant this when he wrote it. But this is the story of, Dorothy, who was at home and gets taken away from her home and looks around at this strange place and is trying to figure out how to get back home, and places her hopes on this quasi-deity, the wizard, and finds this little band of misfits to help her, and they're all seeking courage, brains, and heart. And they go along this journey, and they encounter different things, they try different things, and finally they get to meet this great grand wizard. And they and Karen Armstrong was Toto for me, just pulling that curtain back like, oh crap, this is not as grand as I thought it was. And what emerges from that, though, is that they look within themselves and they find out that even though they thought courage, brains, and heart depended on this outside entity, actually, if they look within themselves, they'll find those things. They find the courage, they find the heart, they find the brains. And ultimately, Dorothy's able to return home with a new appreciation. And I think that's the picture for me that resonates the most now in my life. I think if I was to put words or language around specifically what occurs after that second picture for me, it is, instead of a degeneration into nihilism on that kind of Garden of Eden view, it is a repolarization, I would say. So it's changing my thought process and my living process from counting on outside stuff to counting on inside stuff, and letting the inside world guide me. So specifically, and I heard you raise some questions about morality, justice, and so on. I might start with morality just very quickly. I think that if you look at the moral philosophy of the last, or really the moral philosophy around the time of the Enlightenment, that philosophy was concerned with a picture of humanity which starts as a fundamentally rational, self-interested human being. It starts with the picture of what the technical term rational egoism, that what is rational to do is what is good for you selfishly. And you can see the kind of the apogee of this hit with Ayn Randian ego objectivism, right? Egoism. But I think that picture is fundamentally flawed. It's wrong. It turns out human beings do not start from the place of looking for reasons to behave morally. They actually start from the place of looking for reason or behaving morally, and then finding reasons to not behave morally occasionally, you know? So it's like when, so the whole upshot of moral conversation for me is about refining those pro-social impulses that we have. It's not a question of trying to convince somebody to be moral. And by the way, you know, I mean, there are a small percentage of people in the world who are that way. They're called psychopaths. And I don't, and no moral philosophy as of yet that's supposedly rational or Christian or whatever has worked for these people. Yeah. They just start from the assumption they don't care, right? So for me, you know, and the lived-in experience was after I left the faith, although I had questions about what could ultimately ground secular ethics, I had always said things like you just said, like, oh, if I wasn't a Christian, I would go whatever, you know, do all these crazy immoral things, because I felt like somehow that was the only thing holding me back. And actually, once I dropped the faith, it was like, oh, nope, still me. I still want to be a good person. With the exception of sex, that changed almost overnight.
That's always the one.
Yeah, it's always the one. That changed right away. But other than that,
not stupid after all.
Yeah, I mean. Oh, so that's how I would kind of think about the moral picture. And then I'll just say one more thing on the question of kind of ultimate justice and the project of human. We could say politics in a much broader sense, not the kind of narrow antagonistic sense we think of it today. But in that sense, the human project, I think, again, it's this repolarization. So if we count on something outside of us to kind of rectify the picture of injustice which permeates our world, if we count on that on the outside, I think we lose something, because, or at least I would say, for me, it turned out when I didn't have that to count on, it actually put more of an emphasis on the now, more value on, gosh, what can we do? Because it turns out there is no afterlife that will fix these things for these people. It's actually important that we do something now or nothing will get done.
Yeah.
And at the same time, it's like you know what it's like is like have you ever messed around with photography where you can change the trying to, I think it's the white balance is the way, but basically you can make the darks darker and the lights lighter. And if you take a picture, you can like narrow the range of the colors, or you can widen the range of the colors. And it felt like for me as an atheist, it like widened the range. It was like the darks were darker because there is nothing at the end to make it better, but the lights were lighter. It was like, this is the now, and I can be fully present and experience something that's great right now in my life, and I'll never get to experience it again. I'll never get to be with this person after they die, say, but right now I'm with this person, and it's a fantastic thing. So that's kind of how it affected me.
I can very much understand that.
Well, here, I got a question for you.
Go ahead.
What do you think that we lose when we lose God?
I think in some ways when a question like that arises, it illustrates what I think the contribution of Jordan Peterson is. Well, I've been talking in some of my more recent videos about God aspect 1 and God aspect 2.
I saw this. I was watching that last night. Yeah.
And the reason I differentiate this now, I believe the Christian God has both of those aspects. Let me say that on the bat. So I'm not talking this God or that God. But what has happened, I think, especially in evangelicalism, and this really came to the front in the 70s, and I think Chuck Colson's story is a great illustration of what happened, where I think Jordan Peterson is basically re-articulating what every person in the world knew before 1500, when God started to die.
Yeah.
And so what happened in late stage secularity, the fundamentalists, I mean, in a sense, their plight got so desperate that they doubled down on God aspect 2.
Right.
At the expense of God aspect 1.
Mm-hmm. You might want to put just a little icing on that, so your viewers or at least my viewers, of which it's like my mom, but you might just want to give it a little clarity on what you mean by God number 1 and God number 2.
God number 1 is the God who has made all of this. If you think, for example, about if Bilbo Baggins became aware that he's living in a story and that there's an author to this story, or there's this great scene during the siege of Gondor or Minas Tirith in the 3rd movie, when Gandalf and I think it's Pippin are having this conversation, and Pippin says, "I didn't think it would end like this," and Gandalf said, "End?" So Pippin's the secularist, and Gandalf's like, "Oh, come on, Pippin. You're going to go off to the Grey Havens," or
Yeah.
But so in a sense, to what Tolkien is to Bilbo Baggins, God is to us in this story, the God aspect 1, where he's the author of this. Now it's a special kind of story.
Sure.
greater than what Tolkien would be able to do, because Tolkien is only a sub-creator. But the God that in him we in him, as Paul quotes a pagan, in him we move and live and move and have our being. It's the assumption of God that every pre-modern person simply assumed. Okay.
Right.
So then what happens later in God aspect 2 is, as that continues to decrease, Chuck Colson goes to his mainline Episcopal Church and in kind of the Cold War fashion is doing all the mainline stuff. We're employing God to combat the godless Russians,
right,
the Soviets and communists.
Right.
Well, then Chuck Colson has this conversion experience in which I can talk to God and I can have a personal relationship with God. And when I pray, God answers prayers. Now,
right.
Now, what's implicit in highlighting that aspect is, and I'm kind of a jerk sometimes with people because I speak my mind. I'm real low.
I'm counting on it.
I'm real low in neuroticism. I'm not that high in agreeableness. I'm in the 60s.
Okay. All right.
So I'm enough to be a pastor. But
I'm in the like 90s on agreeableness. So
I'm with a group of Christians, and this evangelicalism has gotten more and more pervasive in a conservative denomination like the Christian Reformed Church. And a friend of mine will say, well, that's a God thing. And then I'll say, yeah, as opposed to the rest of creation, I'm poking, I'm saying, hey, yeah, God aspect 2. Right. Does God answer prayer? Yes. But don't forget, he is the author of all of this. And so what had tended to happen, especially in Pentecostalism, is they were living in a disenchanted world, and they're re-enchanting it via their religiosity, as opposed to an ancient person for whom the world is just enchanted. And so it's a special deal when God shows up. Now, yes and no. So
it's interesting that first God, it reminds me of like Tillich and the ground of being, that kind of, which is funny because that actually came after God number 2, as you're talking about, as a way of thinking about God in a very almost like deistic sense, I would say. So if I'm getting you right, God number 1 and God number 2 is like deism versus a more personal God. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. So what? Oh, go ahead.
Well, and so when you listen to Harris and Peterson is taught, the God who chooses, and we see this through Darwinian selection, and the God who is always acting through all of this stuff. And I did a little video about randomness and supernatural, all these edges that this God who is just all over the place for Peterson. And Sam Harris says, no, that's not God.
Right.
This is how Sam Harris, gives away his point in history and which group of Christians he's looking at. And Peterson, in a sense, says, all right, yeah, there's those people over there, and Peterson has shown a fair amount of respect. These poor people, you've kicked out all their axioms, and they're really upset. And that's why they, in a sense, behave the way they do. But if you don't read mythology and history, you're not going to understand that all of the world has assumed all of this. And just like Nietzsche, you don't pull this away without consequences. And so Harris says, no, it's the God who gets angry when you masturbate, or it's the God who answers prayer. And see, what you would have would be like the ancient, you would have an integrated God where 1 and 2 is actually integrated, so that when you have the dark night of the soul, when you've called the elders and anointed with oil and spoken in tongues, and you've done all the little things that are supposed to make your prayers really work. And when you find a person whose prayers are always answered and God doesn't show up, God is still there, because God is the author of this. And then suddenly you have to confront the suffering and the void and the absence of God. And I think that's part of the story. It's not a deviation from the script, which is, I don't want to get into too much Christian intramural bickering, but
right.
You know, when I read like Bethel, you might know who, you know, Bethel Church is north of us in Reading. They're a huge Pentecostal church right now. And if you read Bill Johnson's things, on one hand, when he says the kingdom of God is at hand, I say, yes.
Sure.
But then when Jesus says, you know, okay, God, let's do this another way, and God says no. And when Jesus is on the cross, he says, my God, Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me?
Right.
And it's at that moment where actually you get the, in a sense, this is the center, that and the resurrection, it's the center of the Christian story, the abandonment of God and the resurrection of Jesus, and they're held together. And so when I listen to your story, part of me hears a rebalancing of our understanding about God.
Yeah, that's what it feels like for me. Like, I think on the conception that you just laid out between God number one, I'm willing to say, if we use God language, I'm okay with thinking of roughly of God number one. That, because to me, there's no personal deity there. There is, it's something that is impersonal. And to me, that just feels right. But it's number two, it's the personal God that doesn't feel, I see the value of it, but I think that that's the God I don't think we can accept if we accept in some of the Enlightenment, specifically the scientific revolution. Do you mind if I kind of give a quick bullet points for what
go ahead.
Okay, yeah. On that God number two point, there's a book written by Gregory Dawes. It's called Theism and Explanation. And I thought it was such a great summary, or really it's a distillation and a crystallization of, felt like to me, of really the entire scientific enterprise, starting with around Copernicus time. And the idea is that in the modes of knowing what is true in the world, which is asking ourselves, how can we explain things? That there are good kinds of explanations, there are virtues of those explanations that work, and there are explanations which don't work. And so he outlines what he takes it to be the virtues of the explanations that work. And so this is one of the virtues is falsifiability. So if you take the phenomenon of lightning, it used to be thought that lightning was something that the gods just meted out as punishment or something like that, right? Or it was random. But once we were able to identify natural causes for that, once we were able to put an explanation forward that was falsifiable, we found that explanation fared better. And that explanation was, hey, it has to do with electromagnetism. And so we can falsify the electromagnetism explanation by testing it. Does lightning occur if whatever it is, I don't know how lightning works, actually, if the ions are aligned or something like that. But on the other hand, the supernatural explanation, does lightning occur if the gods are angry? Well, it's really hard to know whether the gods are angry, right? So it's really difficult to test that bit. So the explanation that fared better was the falsifiable one. And of course, also the explanation that's consistent with background information, that's consistent with the data. And also, this is key, the explanation that posits the least amount of things in the world, extra things in the world, or what's called ontological economy. So if we posit that lightning is explained by the natural world, by whatever electricity or electromagnetism, whatever it is, that's actually positing less things than if there's a bunch of deities in the world and they're using lightning to get at humans, right? That's not an ontologically simple explanation. So that, I think, if I was to just paint the history of the scientific revolution leading up to now in terms like that, we could imagine a giant long list of phenomena to be explained: lightning, fertility, there's like thousands and thousands of things, right? And the scientific revolution marched forward with these kinds of explanations and systematically, one by one, disabused us of belief in supernatural causes and went to the natural causes. So then the question is just, why then bet on the supernatural horse at all if the natural horse seems to be winning all its races, right? And so I think that for me, that's when you talk about that number two personal God, that's the intellectual case. But then the lived-in experience case is that I've seen it go so wrong. I've seen people, like I had a friend of mine, her mom had cancer, and the people around her believed it was the reason she had cancer, and the reason she wasn't healed was because she hadn't prayed hard enough, or she didn't really believe. And I just think, gosh, that category of thought pushes people who adopt it to really strange places not worth caring about. It's not worth, in my view, humanity thinking that medical problems can be solved by praying. It's not. Now, psychological problems, maybe that's different, meditation, whatever, like that's even prayer, like I think the practice of praying might have some value. But when we think of those in the world ills, like medical ills, I just don't think those categories help us. I don't know, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, a few thoughts. I think a really helpful book to give perspective on the story you just told, I think, is Charles Taylor's A Secular Age. I mean, he essentially calls that a subtraction story in terms of, we used to think that lightning was God's throwing thunderbolts, and today we know that this is, the clouds. When we look at the story that way, we are able to understand a set of physical actions and dynamics by virtue of intentionally taking the mind out. And this is a lot of what Thomas Nagel has written about that. And this is a very, very powerful and helpful tool. Mm-hmm. Now, let's say, okay, we know, let's use rain and cloud seeding. So there's a member of my church who is actually an internationally well-known hydrologist. He's a retired chief hydrologist for the state of California. He's also a very conservative Christian and has some of those ideas that, anyway, but one of the things he's very interested in is cloud seeding, which is where, they want to enhance the production of the clouds by flying a plane over and dropping things in it. At some point, you have to say, well, there's the stuff we're tinkering with in terms of the natural order, which isn't really any different than me moving my hand. But when it comes to me moving my hand, well, what is moving my hand? This is where the question gets a little hard.
It's dicey.
And, Sam Harris is right there at the front line of it. Is there a me moving my hand? Or has, from the beginning of the Big Bang, which we can't explain, if you think Calvinists are determinists, there's a long cause of effect that puts me and Andy Walter over Zoom with me moving my hand as an illustration. Yeah. So the question of whether it's billiard balls or lightning or agency in this world, it's a more complicated question. In a sense, we've simplified the question by reducing variables when we look at things, but that hasn't actually produced the kind of mastery over the kinds of things that we hope for. For example, I mean, think about the question this way. Yeah. Bilbo Baggins is sitting in his hobbit hole and he asks himself, are trolls natural? Well, trolls seem to do what trolls seem to do, and you want to catch them in the sunlight so that they can turn to stone and so on and so forth. The story from The Hobbit. Yeah. But natural, in a sense, and this is part of Charles Taylor's point, there's this intermediate phase that Charles Taylor calls providential deism, where we kind of separated God from the mechanics. And I think that was a helpful phase. And there were a bunch of people like Newton that were working on this. He was also working on alchemy, and he also had some rather strange and heretical
very
Christian
bizarre
ideas.
Views.
So on one hand, I can appreciate the fact that, hey, you know what? Praying a lot wasn't anywhere near as effective at stopping plague than getting rid of rats. Right. And a lot of the Christian solutions for addressing the plague made things worse. Here's the problem.
Come to church and pray together.
Well, that's right. Well, Well, and also for a while, the problem are the cats and the dogs. And so they got rid of the cats and the dogs. And what that meant was that the rat population increased and the plague got worse. Right. So on one hand, we shouldn't discount or dismiss the capacity that we have shown to engage what C.S. Lewis would call nature for outcomes we desire. That's a blessed thing. Right. But that practice isn't fundamentally different from pre-scientific practices, which was, well, if I disagree with the guy next door, I'm going to take some poison and kill him, or take a knife and stab him. We haven't actually changed the story. We've just created much more. We've just have much better mastery over the systems. And I think.
You mean we haven't changed the human impulses?
That's right. Right. And I think actually.
Or I might say we haven't changed the shadow, but. Right.
Well, think about, read. So there's this great place in the book of Samuel where Jonathan and his sword bearer have found a group of Philistines, and he kind of has an idea for a daring, raid to try and trick them. And the way he talks about God is, let's do this. And who knows, God might be able to save. Right. There's always a sense in the Bible of God is that which we cannot have instrumental, that we cannot be instrumental over, but yet he is the range of possibilities. Yeah. And to me, that doesn't discount any of the processes that we can now engage with. They to me are fundamentally the same as my mind moving my hands. And the irony is, we are not, we can talk about neurons and how these mechanisms work, but we've really not made much progress in terms of figuring out mind matter. at all.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really helpful to just begin with the assumption that, and actually Einstein did this all the time. Let's just begin with the assumption that things are this way, and let's proceed accordingly. And that's what we've done. But then we've also discovered all these unintended consequences, which are, wow, we can refine petroleum and create gasoline, and we can go down the street and not have all this horse manure to deal with. Isn't that wonderful? And about 90 years later, we realize, yeah, we were making CO2, but the amount of CO2 we're putting in the atmosphere, this could doom us all.
Right. Yeah. And I do think there's two separate questions there. One is how successful are natural versus supernatural explanations. And then there's a different question of how successful is our society as a result of having dropped the supernatural altogether. And I don't think they're terribly related. Like, it may be true that natural explanations just are more successful, regardless of that's the effects on the population, you know. And I think maybe I'll just leave some. There was plenty in there that I could take issue with, but maybe to kind of get to some of this Peterson stuff. Maybe we could. I'll just bracket that the question of the success of or failure of natural versus supernatural explanations, and then let's shift now to the question of, okay, so we have a society that's dropped the supernatural, and we do have these unintended consequences. And Jordan Peterson seems to have come in and reanimated so much of what was worth reanimating about religion. One of the questions I have for you as a pastor, and I'm honestly just curious about this, is what do you think it is that Jordan Peterson is doing different than what pastors have been doing all along? Like, it isn't as if there aren't people in our society who are saying, hey, come look at the Christian stories, these will change your life. I mean, that's like many street corners in America that there are people doing that, like yourself, for a full-time job. But Peterson comes along and does something different. And I'll taint this a little bit by saying, in my view, I think what's good about, or the reason this is working with Peterson, is he is not forcing people to accept God number two. He's not forcing people to accept this personal God, which I just don't think we can accept on a more Enlightenment approach. But I don't know, how do you explain it? What do you think?
Well, I'm continuing. I mean, this is what got me into this, because I know how many people in Toronto, I have a couple of friends in Toronto that are pastors in Toronto, and there's plenty of empty seats in their churches. And in my opinion, they're A-class preachers and pastors.
Right.
That they're not turning the world upside down. And here comes this professor of psychology at University of Toronto, and he's selling out this Bader Theater, and he's rambling about the Bible, and he, with all due respect, he's coming at the Bible in a different way. And
he totally is.
And the main part of what has been the conversations about the Bible, he's relatively uninformed in, and that's
which is so hilarious, isn't it? Like, I know you're saying a longer answer, but just to pause here, I think it's so funny to watch Peterson, because he's so against postmodernism, and yet the one of the biggest critiques from postmodernism is you can read almost anything you want to into a story, and it looks to me that's exactly what he's doing with all these biblical stories, and to me, that's okay, because it's still interesting. Like, I think his mind is interesting, and I want to know how it works. I think it was Nietzsche who said something like, philosophies are really nothing more than, the thoughts of philosophers. Like, it's watching somebody kind of plumb into the depths of their psyche. That's what a philosophy is. And to me, that's what Jordan Peterson is doing. Like, I've heard preachers preach wildly different messages from the same passages that he's using, but it's just interesting to me to know what would happen if you put a clinical psychologist in front of the biblical text and said, go. It's interesting.
I think so. The story you just told, the subtraction story, has been a very successful story.
Yeah.
And in fact, so many people, and many of the people I'm talking to, so now the more and more people I talk to that find me because of my videos, so on and so forth, the patterns begin to emerge.
Yeah.
And the patterns have been, I grew up in the church, or I didn't grow up with any religion at all, and I got to a point and I went to university and I found out that there are these explanations for physical things that we used to attribute to the gods. And now here's the thing that we don't often say. We have a degree of control and prediction about them. That really helps us feel better, because we, as small, fearful primates, are realize that the world is big and scary, and this story that is us, that we're very attached to, can be taken away at any time, and this stalks us and haunts us. Okay, so the idea that we can exercise a degree of control around our world in order to give ourselves the outcomes we desire, this really pleases us.
It's an attractive idea.
It's a very attractive idea. Trust me.
Yes. Yeah, it's like, oh, maybe the big cats with the big teeth won't eat me now.
That's right.
It's what it feels like. Yeah. Okay. I'm with you.
So anyway, and then the Bible then begins to be assumed as, this is a book, and exactly what Sam Harris said, this is a book of made up stories that ancient people used. This is archaic, obsolete technology, and we are beyond it. Now,
it's kind of hand
there, not telling of the story. There's a large degree of hubris, of pride, some huge assumptions, but basically the idea is that, those stories might be interesting, but as I said before, by the 1860s, a good number of the church began to read the Bible and say, it's good for morals, but not good for science or history.
Right.
At the end of the Cold War, it began to change even further. It's not even good for morals. Okay, so we're going to get rid of the whole thing. Jordan Peterson comes along and says, it's really funny that chimps are afraid of snakes, and a chimp that has never seen a snake, you put a snake in that chimp's cage and boom, that chimp goes crazy. Why is that? Or the cucumber test with cats. Slide that cucumber next to your cat who's feeding in the dish. Just go to YouTube and watch that cat freak out. What does that mean? Well, it means that, and this is all via science, this body, this way of this sociology that we have a great deal of trust in, that there's something built into us.
Yeah.
He comes along and says, isn't it funny that this story in this garden has a snake?
Right. Oh my gosh. I just have to tell you, do you mind if I pause for a second and identify with that? Because so let me back up. Ayahuasca. Have you heard of it?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So it's the big one. It's like the most powerful hallucinogenic on the planet. I started with ayahuasca. That was my first ever anything. And so it's like, and the first image that came to me on that experience was a snake. And it was this giant red snake that could have filled a football field. And I mean, the whole experience was just so profound and mind-blowing. I didn't know what to make of it afterwards, and it took me a couple months to even really kind of integrate it at all. But a couple months later, I was at this art film, and it's called El Abrazo del Serpiente. And see, and because you speak Spanish, you know where the story is going. And so, but I didn't even put it together. And so watching this art film, and it's all in black and white until the very end, where there's this moment and this guy goes on a trip and it becomes all color. And just in the first few seconds, I knew, oh, this is DMT, which is the chemical agent in ayahuasca. This is what this guy's experiencing. And it turns out that is what the story was based around. And the symbolism in the movie had all of this snake stuff. And then I went back and I realized, I looked online, it's actually quite common for people who do DMT to have an experience of a serpent, which was mind-blowing to me because I had no dog in that fight. I had no desire to see a snake, no interest, nothing. It was just more or less came out of my, like, deep in my psyche or something. So that is that Jordan Peterson thing of, like, or it's the Jungian thing, really, like, these archetypes are embedded way down into your psyche. And I think that's part of what he's doing, is helping people get down into that realm. And that's really what the mythological stuff does, in my view, is it anchors just way deeper in our psychology than, like, the rationalism of Harris, you know?
Well, this is exactly right. And so when he says this story and everybody hears this story, they're like, and so, well, what this does is we begin to say, well, what he does when he does his biblical lectures is he practices, I think, one of his primary messages, which is that, okay, so we have this subtraction story. The subtraction story is about 160, 170 years old, 300 years old, if we go back to some of the early adopters, that basically said, okay, well, this is how we can get a handle on our world and control our world to achieve for ourselves the outcomes we desire. Okay? So there's the personal motivation in this. But psychology, how old is psychology? 20th century, end of the 19th century, it's not very old. All this stuff that we know from medicine, few decades old.
Right.
And then the more, the deeper we start getting into these very young sciences, we begin to realize, maybe drawing all these conclusions from studies done at mostly white students in American universities wasn't exactly a, good idea for a sample.
Right. Yeah.
Humans are so complex. So that's okay. So then we're going to do samples in other countries. Well, that's fine. But we're still doing samples in 2018. Well, how do we know what someone in 1750 thought? Well, that doesn't matter because they're okay. But now suddenly what's exposed is our bias regarding what a human being is. And the deeper our knowledge penetrates, the more we realize that there is a significant difference between someone in 2018 and someone in 1750. Well, how about 1500? What about 1250? And then you start going. And so in a sense, what Peterson says is that the only way we can really orient ourselves, let's assume the secular paradigm. So we have to orient ourselves within the iron box of secularity. There's no God to tell us anything new, okay? Let's assume that.
Yeah.
So how should then we orient ourselves? Well,
right.
We're going to use science. Okay, we're going to use science. But science is only this old, and all of science's data has been enormously selective. And even the way the clouds work in 2018, we've been changing the clouds since the Industrial Revolution. And we know this because of tree samples and ice cores. So how did the clouds work before the vapor trails were over that we suddenly in 9/11 realized, oh, all those vapor trails, they're doing something. I mean, we don't know enough to know how we've been changing the world. So then Peterson comes along and let's use this hypothesis that we can all agree we will know more if we expand the data set. Yeah. We wish we had a data set that went back further and that was more broad. So Peterson basically says, okay, well, instead of hoping for the data we don't have, let's look at the data we do have. And you might say, well, we got these old stories, but they're not data. Peterson basically says, what if they are?
Right.
And then in the biblical series, he says, why is there a snake in the garden? Psychologically, if I look at this story like from a psychologist, and then what he then he communicates under the surface is there's truth in these stories.
Right. Yeah. And there's fundamental psychological realities which these stories speak to and animate, and it's no accident that they remained popular, right? We can put icing on that and say, well, maybe some of them were just sort of tag-alongs to bigger stories and actually doesn't matter, or whatever. But in general, yeah, I think that's totally valid from a psychological standpoint, because so I'm a programmer, or I used to be a programmer for many years, and for me, it feels like we're gradually working out the machinery that we're running on, the hardware, the software, and we haven't figured. We figured out like some of the hardware, like that bit is fairly straightforward. But we still haven't figured out all the hardware, the brain. I mean, there's a lot of hardware there we don't even know.
I mean,
sure, there's but then the software on top of that running, that's really complex, and there's bugs in our code that haven't even been debugged, and there's so much going on, and this program has been running since like the beginning of whatever, for the last 200,000 years or so, however long humans have been around. And it's been transferred from human being to human being and copied, and errors have been made, and other things added, and it's just enormously complex. And so, even as if I was a materialist, I could say, I think I probably am. Even as a materialist, I could say there is still space for looking at these biblical stories as an effective way of cutting through, as kind of a shortcut to cutting through human psychology to stuff that we know that works. And until we have this much larger picture, which to me is like, 3, 4, 5 centuries away or something like that, we can really understand all the software. It's not even like let's keep doing it. It's worth trying to understand it, but in terms of trying to change people's lives, forget it. I'm not going to try and change your life by citing you a study. That there's no way that would work. And I think I don't know. I suspect maybe if this was phrased to Harrison the right way, he might concur with this, but he's often painted as this rationalist who just actually believes, no, the best way to change people's lives is hand them a stack of studies. I don't know that he believes that, but certainly the way that Peterson has lived his career, it's been the polar opposite of that. It's been, how do I actually change people's stories or change people's lives? I tell them stories, and it just works, and we just know it works.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, and here's the crazy thing about the Bible, and for those of us who live in this, sometimes people say the Western world is weird. It's Western, it's egalitarian, it's industrialized, it's wealthy, it's educated, it's democratic, it's all this stuff. Most of the world doesn't live that way. Most of the world hasn't lived that way.
Right.
And so, like, we're awash in books and information. I mean, and the Bible's impact. I mean, the number 2 book in terms of print copies in the world is Mao's Red Book. Mm-hmm. How many people do you know that have read Mao's Red Book? That's number 2.
Right.
And it's not, it's not a close second to the Bible. It's like, and the crazy thing about the Bible is that this book has been twisting people's noodles for thousands of years.
Right.
And so then you, at just a scientific thing, you just have to pause and ask, what is the deal with this book?
Right.
I mean, is this like crack? I mean,
yeah, it's a really interesting, we could even go one layer deeper than that and say, okay, so if this book is so popular, but really it's just a Christian message. And so what about the Christian message is so fundamental to human psychology that it works? And I'd be interested to know your answer. I mean, it's a big question. Don't screw it up.
I would push back and say it's the book. Because so what happens, so missionaries went out and we're going to spread Christianity. But the Christianity they tried to spread was obviously deeply contextualized within their culture and filled with their culture. Okay? Just a guy I know just wrote a book about George Whitefield, who just incredible, phenomenal man in his generation. And the thesis of his book is, he pushed Christianity, but he also pushed empire and his view of the world. It's like, duh, every missionary does that. But what happened was missionaries went out, we're going to give you our religion. And it's almost always a complete and utter failure. But what they leave behind is this book. And then people take this book and they do things with it. And so then the missionaries are, oh gosh, they're filled with heresy and they're all wrong and they get everything wrong. Yeah. But what's happening here that maybe we should pay a little bit of attention to, which is that somehow, and this is happening in Africa, this is happening in Asia, where Christian missionaries were kicked out, or finally the missionaries left. And then the Africans said, get out of here. What this book says is this. And do they get things horribly wrong? Of course. But this has been what's happening in the world. And, even Oral Roberts University, in a sense, that's, the frontier story in American Pentecostalism and all of this stuff. It's the Bible out in the wild. And it's enormously messy business. But and then what kind of emerges from this again and again and again are elements of Christianity and its story, but it also engages with, it seems, has a capacity to engage with every culture we've known in this world in a way that on one hand produces some unique things, usually some troubling and disturbing things, but also some other things that hold in common with the much longer narrative. And so I think, I found Don Hoffman very helpful in terms of the image he gave me about us trying to deal with reality, because I doubt we as human beings are actually capable of telling someone else exactly what the work of Christ is, because any articulation I do that with must be embedded within my cultural framework, which includes all of these other layers.
Right.
And so I think what could be happening with Peterson is he is actually a part of the process of Christianity. It's kind of absorbed all the Enlightenment stuff and, the atheist pushback and all of this stuff. And it could be that it's turning again. And now this, of course, bothers pastors and Christians because, there's going to be heresy. Yep, there's going to be heresy, okay? Count on it.
Yeah.
But what I think we've seen through the history of the church is that God is also going to continue the story.
Right.
Even amongst the heretics.
Right. I mean, well, and of course, you could I would put that in a more of a Hegelian framework of spirit. And so the idea of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and I would see all of human history and all of human culture if in the aggregate as this. I wouldn't necessarily isolate it just to the church or just to a book, but I would certainly agree with many of the things you just said in that story, because I think that's the way human culture evolves. And so you see this in an integral theory now, to me seems like the new Hegelianism. And it's this idea that for each phase of human development, we can take the good parts and then go on to the next phase, right? And that's hopefully what's coming next. And I think there's something in the water now about where we're headed. I'm using the term the grand synthesis. I don't know what other people are using. I think the integral people, I think, just want to say it's the integral stage, which sounds boring to me. I like grand. But but it feels like we're at this point where we're seeing a convergence of enlightenment values, of the reanimation of religious and mythological tradition. We're seeing psychological progress in terms of psychedelics and them becoming more widely available, and that whole movement. And we're seeing also men's work and masculinity come out in a way that I think is very healthy. And there seems to be this convergence of all of these different pieces on something new. And I don't know what exactly the shape of that will be, but I feel like it's in the water. But I don't know. Do you get that same sense?
I don't know.
Oh man, I was hoping you'd be excited.
Well, I think I don't know what Peterson is doing, and I have a sense of what Peterson is doing. That's what I've been working on for 8 months now.
Yeah.
Where it's going, it's really hard to know. I think a lot of what you're saying is true in that, when I say talk to David Fuller and and Ali, the Rebel Wisdom guys,
yeah,
and have them, they visit my church and they listen to my sermon and they say, "Oh, that's a really interesting idea." And I think, well, are you just being kind because, preachers feel insecure about their sermons, or, did you really find something interesting? And if so, what? I think it could be that maybe so let's assume, so you decide you're going to leave the faith, and of course that's hard on your parents and it's hard on you, and so you go through a process. Then at some point you come out of it and your parents are willing to, are ready to engage with you, and your mom still watches your video, and however that goes.
Great.
There's a when you emerge from something, there's this kind of a shock period where everyone is kind of tense and sore, and your skin is inflamed. But then things start to settle down, and now we can actually have a conversation. And when I listen to you now, I think we're getting to the point that, maybe, we're getting to the point now that we can have this conversation again, and we can have it. You're not afraid that the church is going to burn you at the stake. That's a good thing.
Right.
And now maybe I'm a little bit more afraid that the atheists are going to burn me at the stake. And
we're not going to burn you at the stake. I agree. We have a club meetings and everything, and it's been outlawed. So
good.
Yeah.
So maybe now, because we don't have these imbalances of the fact that, the Peace of Augsburg, Christianity gets wedded with the civil structures, and that caused a world of their own problems. So we're at a point now where maybe we can have some productive conversations. And I think Peterson is modeling that. And Peterson, I understand why Peterson scares Sam Harris.
Yeah.
And he should. Peterson is basically saying to Sam Harris, you haven't read enough.
Right.
You haven't fully appreciated God, number one. And what happens when you take him out.
Right.
And I think also Peterson is right that I've said for a long time, the culture war we're having in the West right now is a Christendom civil war. And they may not be in church, but they've been deeply formed by Christianity. But Christianity, as expressed in the West, has been deeply formed by all kinds of other things too. So we have a capacity to talk together. And where this goes now, obviously, as a Christian, I have eschatology in my background, but Christianity hasn't worked through a consensus on eschatology like it has on Christology. Is it post-mill? Is it a-mill? Is it pre-mill? Dispensational? I mean, all that stuff is in the water amongst Christians. So I agree with you in that I think we're at a point now where we're not as reactive as we were, and we can sit down and have a productive conversation, and we can look at some things and not.
Yeah.
And I think what we're doing today is part of that.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. And it's, you know, another thing is, it's right now in our society, it feels like to interact with somebody who disagrees with you is to somehow have made some kind of moral failing. You know, it's like you can't go across the aisle. If you're a liberal, you can't talk to Republicans, vice versa, because those people are evil, or you know, we demonize them. And we've lost this like public square where we can say, even if we disagree about maybe even some fundamental things, how can we still move forward as human beings living in community and make the world better for everyone? And that sense seems to have been lost. But yet, in this kind of IDW space, it does feel like we're reclaiming some of that, to be able to have these conversations in a civil way and hopefully in a productive way without having to demonize the other side. Right. And I'm just so thankful that this kind of movement, or whatever we're calling it, has taken shape, because I spent most of my life around people that are now on the total polar opposite of the spectrum for me. And I know that these are good people. You know, these are my parents who are working in Alaska at the Salvation Army, with the homeless and with the drug addicts, and they're making the world a better place in their own way. And yeah, I don't agree with everything, but these are not terrible people. And I just feel like as human beings, we've somehow entered this highly polarized space, and it feels so good to pull back from that and be able to genuinely connect. Yeah. So, and I should say we should probably get going, so we might consider leaving it there.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a great way to end it. And I really appreciate the fact that you made some videos and sent me a little note that said, hey, I mentioned you in a video. And because so much of this, you know, what we're doing now, and I can, you know, I'm sure you can get in trouble with some of your folks for talking to this Reformed pastor.
I'm going to get in trouble for not calling every single point that I disagreed with out, I'm sure. But
and I can get in trouble with, you know, I'm actually, people can actually threaten my livelihood.
Right.
By listening to me talk, and if I don't say things in the right way.
Right.
But I want to take that risk. And what again, it blows my mind that what Jordan Peterson has facilitated, at least in my little corner of the world, is that twice a month I get together with 15 to 25 people from radically different backgrounds, and we talk about what we think the world is like. And there are atheists, and there are, you know, some people who grew up in the Middle East, and we're able to sit in a room and have these conversations, which all of us are finding productive and meaningful. And to me, as a Christian minister, who I'll put my cards on the table, I want to evangelize people. I want people to become Christian. And if I want people to give it up, I totally get that. We can be adults and understand this, but where we can speak freely with each other and be able to, and of course, this has always been the case. Just like you said, you and your parents, you're dead to me. I don't think your parents said that.
No, they didn't. No.
And God bless them for that, because some parents do.
Yeah.
So
yeah, no, I think there's this, the repolarization thing for me extends into this space of like, okay, we might have these outside disagreements on this like intellectual level, and we may have important disagreements that actually change the way that we behave. But at the same time, the lived in experience of all of us to some degree or another, but certainly to types like you and me, is wow, I'm looking at the world, I'm trying to figure out the right thing, and I'm working through stuff, I'm discovering, I'm exploring, I'm right sometimes, I'm wrong a lot of the time, and I'm just going to do my best, you know, and it's almost like we'd forgotten that fundamental starting point. So it's nice to have returned to that starting point at the end.
Yeah. So thank you so much. And
yeah.
I'll tell you what I'll do. I've been recording this. I will post it on my channel. I will send you a copy so that you can post it on your channel too.
Awesome. That'd be great. Yeah.
And,
much appreciated.
And we'll see what the comments have, and maybe we'll talk again, because I thought this was very productive and very enjoyable.
Yeah, me too. Absolutely. All right.
Great,
Thanks,
Andy.
Paul.
Take care.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.